All right, hello everyone. Welcome to the current webinar series, the North Central Region Water Network Speed Networking webinar series. My name is Ann Nardi and I'll be the moderator for today's session. I serve as the marketing manager for the North Central Region Water Network. And for those that are unfamiliar with the water network, we are a 12-state extension-led network working to ensure safe and sufficient water supplies across the North Central region. Today, we're going to be focusing on soil health linked to water quality. Soil health is a very popular topic with producers and ag professionals alike, and we know a lot about the benefits of soil health when it comes to various soil health indicators and the agronomic benefits. But when it comes to soil health's impact on water quality off-field, there are a few more unknowns. So we're excited to have a great lineup of speakers today to talk about this subject and to dive more into their research and their work. A couple of housekeeping items for you first. We are using Zoom webinar today. There will be a dedicated time for Q&A after all three presentations, but we encourage you to put your questions for our presenters in the Q&A panel, which you can find at the bottom of your screen. Be sure to read other questions that other attendees have and upvote those if you have a similar question. We'll try to get to as many questions as we can, and we'll start with those questions that are the most popular first. So be sure to upvote fellow questions. We also have a chat feature in this Zoom. Please use the chat feature if you have questions about the North Central Region Water Network, or if you're having any technical difficulties, or if you want to provide any kind of questions or commentary to fellow attendees. But for questions for the panelists, make sure and put those in the Q&A panel to ensure we see them when we're doing the Q&A session. Lastly, if you are having any audio issues, there is a phone-in option that you can use today. Just click the up arrow on the mute icon and switch to phone audio if you're having that issue or need to switch to your phone. And lastly, this session will be recorded, and we include this recording as well as all the recordings of our webinars on our website at northcentralwater.com or .org. All right, so let's get started. We have three different presenters for you today, each going to be talking about some of their work on soil health linked to water quality. Ron Turco of the Purdue University, Will Osterholz from ARS, and Kevin Fermanik from the University of Wisconsin, Madison in the Division of Extension, and UW Green Bay. All right. So first up is Ron Turco. I won't read this whole bio for you, but Ron has been with Purdue for over 30 years studying the environmental microorganisms and influenced by human activity on soil function. So we're excited to have Ron here today to talk about some of the work in the St. Mary's watershed.
All right, thank you. I will, says I can't share my screen yet.
Yep, go ahead.
Okay. Let's see if I can share the right screen. Okay. Okay, is it working?
Oh, yeah, now there.
All right, you're all good. All right, well, thank you for being here today, everyone. There's a whole bunch of you here today. It's nice. This is a project that we've just concluded on the St. Mary's Watershed Initiative. It's called the St. Mary's Watershed Initiative. Basically, it was a very large project, took 4 years, 5 years, had a lot of input, a lot of sponsors, a lot of people involved. At its core, it was a 319 project. For those of you who are familiar with the world of water quality projects, it was a 319 effort sponsored by the Indiana Department of Environmental Management with lots of collaborating organizations along with it. The basically the goals of the project at the outset, which was a long time ago, pre-COVID, everything else that we all experienced recently. The goals were really pretty simple. Can we use local data to change attitudes about water quality protection? And so can we look at sort of different impact areas within the watershed, including soil health and cover crops, nutrient loading of streams, stream health and biological indicators. We had an intensive education program that was mixed in, and we had a piece that you don't see all the time. We had a very rigorous evaluation of attitudes through our human dimensions component. So then from that came some questions on soil health and water quality. That sort of evolved underneath all of this. dramatically, it looks like this. This is sort of a figure we put together on the project where we did a year one baseline social conditions indicator survey work. And then we did 4 years of research on soil health, water quality, biological indicators, and then an outreach and education part. And at the end of the 4 years, we did a impacted social conditions survey. So basically we measured, educated, and then measured again what was going on in the watershed in terms of attitudes about water quality, and then and related to the soil health issues. So it's a big team. I won't go through everybody's name, but just want to let you know there was a lot of people involved in this project. Alyssa Bessers, who's out there in the audience today, she was involved. Becca, Marianne, my group, and then a bunch of other folks from around the college in terms of people involved. Huge group, lots of people. I think at one time I was employing 500,000 undergrads. It felt like that sometimes. So where is the St. Mary's watershed? It's in the northeast corner of Indiana, up near Fort Wayne, south of Fort Wayne. We basically worked in 3 counties, well, 2 counties, and a little bit of a 3rd county. We worked in Allen County, Adams County, and then Wells County, which is, and you can see the little dot. Over here is where it is in Indiana, and then the water flows out of Indiana into Lake Erie. So that's basically, it's a little different than you'd think. So water basically flows from Indiana. It actually flows in from Ohio to Indiana, then back out to Ohio to Lake Erie. So we actually are in the middle of that flow path. We had 2 large watersheds we worked in, Weber and the Nicholson watershed, 16,000, 11,000 acres involved. This is a map of the water sampling sites we put in place for the project. So that gives you some indication there. And then we actually also used the same 2 watersheds for our soils site work. So all the little blue dots on these maps are the two comparative watersheds, again, looking at the soil sampling locations for the project. So soil health came off this map, water quality came off the other map. So there's a lot of things about these kind of studies, which I think is really sort of important to point out, is that there's this geopolitical fiscal situation that occurs with these large field scale studies. And so basically what we found was there's some issues with availability of soil and field locations was sort of limited. Stream sites were typically located at bridges and road intersections and represented the drainage area, not the single field. So that's a big piece of of how difficult some of this work is. Soil sampling sites were constrained by the need to be on sort of similar soil types. So it's we had a kind of a low number of collaborators in the watershed. We thought we'd have more, but we didn't. And that sort of caused us to have to maneuver around that issue. And then we did not capture surface runoff, nor did we capture tile flow volumes. So there was some data that was not taken because of, again, that was a fiscal constraint issue. So soil sampling by site we subdivided after some early survey work by practices. So we had practices, we had manure applications, and cover crop use became a core divider for the project. And what that all resulted in was we ended up, for the soil side of this project, looking at everything via a filter of practice. So we basically ended up having a practice code associated with most of our sites related to what happened in that part of the watershed, that location in terms of a P1 or a P2 or a P3 site, which I'll define in a second. So they were basically sites that were classified by practice and with input from the landowner, the farm manager, and the field observations made. So what does that mean? So that means the practice codes. So we had these 3 practice codes we ended up with as we sorted through the data sets. There's a minimal conservation practices, P1. There's sort of a middle ground, no-till, some use of cover crops, P2 practice. And then the P3 practices were the ones where no-till and cover crop were used, as well as nutrient management planning. So that was the 3 practices. And that becomes important as we begin to have to lump data together and move things around in terms of analysis. So that's why we ended up using this sort of a practice code approach. So some interesting fallout from this, and I'll go through these data sets pretty quickly because there's not a lot of time for the super detail here. But basically, carbon buildup and all things related to carbon, organic matter, nitrogen, POC, and total carbon all tended to increase with intensity of conservation, which is basically P1, P2, 3. Remember, P1's the least in the conservation scenario, and P3 is the most. So there was a general and pretty significant trend upward in all those practices under the practice codes of intense conservation. Those sites that were in the P3 category were tended to accumulate carbon in some manner or another. The other thing that happened that was very interesting was under P3 code, we also saw aggregate stability go up significantly. So P1 versus P2 versus P3, there was a significant increase in aggregate stability as we moved into the more conservation practices. Why are we looking at these? Again, these all related to impact, related to what goes on in those fields related to water and water processing and water retention and water movement off those sites, et cetera. All these were the parameters we put together to sort of do an indirect assessment of those potential water migration questions. So the aggregate stability was going up with the practices. And then we looked at another important aspect in this particular watershed is phosphorus, again, because of Lake Erie. We sorted backwards on that, and we found that cover crops tended to significantly increase the retention of phosphorus in these soils, again, with the implication being that that would not be available for runoff or for movement from the environment. And then so the summary on all this, the soil indicator data was basically organic matter increased, POC increased, autoclavable citrate extractable protein, which is a biomass kind of a processing step indicator increase, total carbon, aggregate stability, water holding capacity, microbial activity, all were increased in the P3 or the conservation practice parts of the watershed. So that's all an important piece of the puzzle on what's going on. We also looked at outflow and river data and water data, and what you can see, I hope in this graph, is basically two bar graphs on the side that show the water data cumulative nutrient concentrations by stream order for the Nicholson and the Weber watershed. This was all cumulative data, and we looked at phosphorus and nitrate out of the watershed, and statistically, the watersheds are identical statistically. But what you do see is some differences in the tile at discharge in these situations. But you also notice that there wasn't much difference in terms of stream order and what the nutrient loads were doing. So overall, the water quality data would indicate that the water quality is similar in the site and was typically better or at the limits set by the state law in terms of water quality goals for the watershed management practices. The other thing in summary for the water quality data was the similar patterns in Nicholson and Weber. The mean values for monthly sampling were below water quality targets. High volumes and values were typically found during storm events. We did a whole set of separate soil sampling, separate water sampling related to storms, and that's really when we were moving major amounts of load. Was then nitrate nitrogen was a nitrate, and dissolved particular phosphorus were highly variable in this watershed. Then there's an ongoing bit of work related to the modeling, which ties back to the soil data into the water data. We're trying to bring the combo of soil indicators and water quality together via modeling. That's really what the key piece and the key outcome from this was. A couple other things I just want to touch on real quickly was that we had a very aggressive outreach program that was highly modified due to COVID, where we basically went online somewhere in the middle of the study. We had a whole series of workshops set up that all went to video. And it actually, I think it worked out pretty well. The chart shows you the topics we covered and whether they were aware or not aware, and whether they were improved by, their knowledge was improved by the participation in the education outreach event. And did you find the information useful? Yes. So it was we thought it turned out to be a very positive aspect. Overall, the human dimension side of this project, year 1 versus year 4, we found some very significant uptick in people's interest in cover crops, people's interest in conservation tillage, conservation planning. was also increased. The only thing that was decreased by our activities was related to nutrient management planning. People were less inclined to use that after the 4 years of our project. We have no idea why that happened, but that was one of the major outcomes from the human dimension side of the project. Overall, the critical points was that the watershed is highly variable on types of land practice being used. It was difficult to sort out specific impacts of a practice on a water quality across the whole watershed. The system is flashy related to storm events. So that's a really big piece of this, is that water movement is very flashy and still in this watershed, even as big as it is. And we did see a positive land practice impacts for improved soil health, implying improved functionality towards water in these systems. And that's actually ongoing in terms of modeling. And then it's still been difficult to directly link water quality at the watershed scale to its particular soil health situation.
All right, great. Thank you so much, Ron. All right, so I do see the questions streaming in, which is wonderful. But we're going to move to our second presentation and then have all the Q&A at the end. So second up is Will Alsterholtz. So I won't read his full bio here, but Will is with ARS in the Soil Drainage Research Unit out of Ohio, originally getting his PhD at Iowa State before coming up here to University of Wisconsin and then down to Ohio. So definitely been over the region, and we'll be talking about some of his research there. So Will, I'll hand it off to you.
All right, let me get my slides up here. Oh geez, where are we going? Let's go to the start. I don't know why it's going crazy. Okay, there it is. All right. Okay, I think we can get started now. So thanks for the invitation. I am a research soil scientist here at the Soil Drainage Research Unit in Columbus. And I'm going to be sharing a little bit about some work we've done in Ohio, trying to connect in-field soil properties with edge-of-field water quality. So soil health is kind of an interesting concept because it's not focused just on a single outcome or function of the soil, but instead we're trying to look at how the soil achieves multiple functions. And the idea is that if a soil is healthy, it can achieve these different functions like crop production, water quality. And just as an example, the NRCS has defined 5 essential functions of a healthy soil. And 3 of these, I would argue, are related to water quality. So regulating water, filtering and buffering potential pollutants, and cycling nutrients. And we also have an example here of from the Nature Conservancy, where they are promoting water benefits as one of the outcomes of a healthy soil. So this is clearly something that people are thinking about. But one of the challenges we have here is trying to distinguish between the effects of soil health itself and the effects of the practices that are used to develop healthy soils. So we can think of a number of different practices such as cover crops, reduced tillage, manure application, that we have pretty good confidence will lead to improvements in soil health. And we also have some evidence that these practices can help improve water quality, especially nitrate. The phosphorus question is still sort of, the jury's out on that one. Some studies have shown increases in phosphorus loss, like Ron was just showing. Some decreases, but for nitrate, we're pretty confident. But I think it's also important to look at this direct connection between the soil health indicators and the water quality outcomes. I think just because we need to understand if we should really be claiming that soil health is providing this function of improved water quality. So our idea with this study is to set aside this focus on specific practices and instead try to focus on the direct relationship between soil properties and water quality. So this is the article we've written. It came out, it was published last year. in Journal of Environmental Quality. I encourage you to look it up if you're interested in more detail about what I'll show. But for this study, we use data from the Ohio Edge of Field network that has been built by Kevin King with the Soil Drainage Research Unit over the past 10 years. It's a network of 40 fields where discharge and nitrogen and phosphorus losses are measured. The fields fall mostly within the northwest corner of the state, as you can see from the map, and that's where we have a lot of tile drainage. And management practices at these sites, they include a range of different tillage, fertilizer, manure, cover crops, controlled drainage. But again, for this study, we weren't really focused on the effects of these practices. And so basically we dumped all 40 fields into one big analysis to try to connect what was being measured at the edge of the field with some in-field measurements. And so the soil properties we measured in these 40 fields, there are 23 of them. So we did sort of our typical agronomic soil tests, things like pH and soil organic matter and the extractable nutrients. And then we also included a few sort of more specialized measurements that are sort of soil health indicators. So those are the ones in bold. We've got water extractable carbon and nitrogen, microbial biomass, potential nitrogen mineralization, bulk density, aggregate stability. So the analysis was pretty simple. We tried to see how these soil properties related to the edge of field discharge, nitrogen loss, and phosphorus loss. And so for all those potential relationships, basically we found that the most consistent relationship between one of these soil health measurements and water quality was that fields with greater water extractable carbon or nitrogen tended to have greater tile nitrate loss. So losses of nitrate through the tile drains. You can see the graphs here are showing that as the water extractable carbon on the top or nitrogen on the bottom increased, we saw a large increase in the amount of nitrate coming out of those tiles. Another really strong relationship we saw that was pretty unsurprising is that fields with greater soil phosphorus also had greater phosphorus losses. So a few other things we noted, I'm not going to go into depth about these, but you can read more about it in the article if you find that interesting. There was some limited evidence of some other relationships besides those couple I just showed, but none of those were very strong or consistent, so you kind of had to squint to see them. The surface runoff data were much more difficult to relate to the soil properties than tile drainage. And that's most likely because there's much greater variability in surface runoff compared to tile drainage. And then we also looked at the size of precipitation events to see if that would maybe influence the relationships between the soil properties and water quality. But there wasn't really anything super clear that came out of that particular analysis. So again, more details in the article if you're interested. And the conclusions of this analysis are that when we looked across this network of fields in Northwest Ohio, we weren't really able to connect healthy soils with better water quality. And in fact, the strongest relationship we saw between soil health and water quality suggested greater losses of nutrients, specifically nitrogen, from healthier soils. So I would argue that we need to be careful about assuming healthy soil is going to equal better water quality. And one of the big takeaways is that management practices themselves probably have a greater influence on water quality than the soil characteristics. And so to that point, I want to take just a couple minutes here to highlight a case study from a project we just got started in the last year and a half. It's a collaboration with Ohio State University, Vinayak Shedekar, there at Ohio State. It's a paired field comparison where we have one field that's been in soil health management for over 30 years. And that management includes diverse cover crops and no-till. And we're comparing that with a conventional field that has regular tillage and a corn soybean rotation, measuring discharge, nitrogen and phosphorus losses, also subsoil health indicators. I'm just going to show the water quality results here. And we only have 1 year so far of data. So this is just from 2021. And if we look at the results here, on the left, we have our soil health practice field, and on the right is the conventional field. This first graph is showing the total water discharge from those two fields. And we can see that in the soil health practices, there's actually less discharge, both from tile drainage as well as surface runoff. If we look at the nitrate loss, we can see a really big difference between the field under soil health practices and the conventional field. That's largely driven by the tile drainage, unsurprising with nitrate. And then for DRP, which is dissolved reactive phosphorus, we can see, again, less DRP coming off of the soil health practice field compared to that conventional field. Even though there was some greater losses in the surface runoff, that was more than compensated for by the reduction through the tile drainage. So I wanted to show this because, I don't want to be all doom and gloom. I do think that soil health practices can be effective for improving water quality outcomes, but the soil itself, healthy soil itself may or may not contribute towards the water quality effects. So I think we need to be clear about that. For water quality standpoint, I really do think it's the practices that have the biggest impact. And this is not the last word on this topic by any means, and we're going to continue to investigate how different soil health indicators relate to water quality outcomes. So with that, I just want to acknowledge the landowners that are generous enough to allow us to work on their fields. Also the various funding sources that have helped fund this over the life of this Edge of Field network work, including several different USDA agencies, some commodity groups, as well as the Nature Conservancy. Oh, and I want to point out that there is an upcoming special section in the Journal of Environmental Quality that should come out later this summer. It's going to include my article as well as, I believe, Kevin's article that he's going to talk about next, in addition to several other interesting articles focused on this topic of relating soil health to water quality. So just keep an eye out for that. So that's all I have. And I guess I'll pass it off to Kevin. I'll to Anne-Marie first.
Great, thanks so much, Will. Certainly a mixed bag there that you're presenting, which is why it's so good to talk about the nuances here. All right. So next up is Kevin. Next up is Kevin Fermanick. Kevin is with the University of Wisconsin-Madison Division of Extension and also a professor at UW Green Bay. And you can read a little bit more about his bio here, but in particular, Kevin, one of the things that we wanted to chat about was he's been a co-PI on a collaborative 6-year project studying the links between edge of field water quality, soil health, and field management across the region. So excited to learn a little bit more about his work. Thanks so much for joining us here, Kevin. I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks, Anne. All right, are we good to go, Anne?
That's great.
Right. Okay. All right, thanks for the invite. And as you might note, some of what I have to say is I think consistent with what Will has said, and Will did a nice job setting up some of our project as well. So our project is, I used this title at one time called Edge of Field Water Quality, but soil health got to do with it. And I think Will answered part of that question just a few minutes ago. And so this project started in 2012 with surface water monitoring through the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, NRCS, and USGS. And then our team with Ron Turco's lab, as well as my group at UW Green Bay, began to do soil health assessments at these edge of field sites in 2016. And so our goal really was to link soil health to edge of field water quality across a number of sites in the Great Lakes. And so this picture here shows an automated edge of field site, and there's a lot of factors that can impact the edge of field water quality, as Will mentioned. And then to the upper right there, that's our soil health monitoring points that we do on a particular catchment. You note that this particular catchment here, actually the tile drainage area and the surface water drainage area are not the same. So that adds to some of the challenges. So this project was funded through NRCS and Great Lakes Restoration Initiative. And as Will said, some of the data from this project, our first analysis, is actually in a forthcoming paper here that I have listed. And others on this project besides Ron's group was Marianne from Purdue, as well as Molly Myers, who I think is on the call today here, and she's kind of been leading the project, and Karen Stahlhaber and Matt Dornbush from UW Green Bay, but then also Matt Comiskey's been leading the USGS part along with Luke Loken, and then Lisa Durancic from NRCS have been part of the project. And I'll point out to the right there, I show that the data from the project has been published into the science base and is available, and additional data will be added to that, to the science database there over the next few years. So we worked on 10 farms, working farms, and that's part of the challenge. 8 of them were is what we ended up using mostly in our analysis. That was 14 edge of field sites. Most of those were tiled, only 8 of them had monitored tile data though. And they were mostly, we had a combination of corn soybean areas, as well as we had sites that were in dairy and corn silage. Manure becomes an important story to our analysis here. Most of the sites, the data I'm going to present is only from the 2016 through 2018 time period. However, we have done intensive sampling in 19 and 21 and reduced sampling in 20. Most of the sites then, the data I'll show are sort of pre-early BMP. And so we're not really looking at the impacts of changes from those BMPs on soil health. So as Will mentioned and Ron mentioned, there's a lot of factors that impact the edge of field soil, edge of field water quality. Some of those are soil health related. And our original goal was, could we look at a gradient of soil health characteristics, either in space or time, and relate those to edge of field water quality. I think Francisco Arriaga has used an image similar to this in the past. We don't really know what this trajectory is, and it seems like we're still defining that. So we've gone in and made measurements, trying to define the area in this green box in the middle. This is sort of our conceptual model, where you've got the soil characteristics in the middle, and then you've got your site factors up top. They all contribute to edge of field water quality, exports, and so on. And I think one of the stories we're seeing is that many times the soil is bypassed, right? And the edge of field water quality is highly impacted by acute fertilizer activities, management practices, obviously timing of rainfall relative to application of fertilizers, and so on. May have a much bigger impact than what these soil health parameters are. Nonetheless, we went ahead and we were trying to characterize a number of these boxes, not all of them and not all of the connections between them, and relate those to the edge of field soil health. Edge of field water quality, excuse me. So I'm just going to give you a couple snapshots. Don't expect you to look at all of the data here, but this just shows our distribution of some of our soil health parameters with chemical parameters across the top. So organic matter, soil test phosphorus, water extractable total nitrogen, some biological factors on respiration, as well as microbial community size, enzymes, and then some physical properties. So we measured infiltration rates and saturated hydraulic conductivity, bulk density, compaction. And we found a pretty good trend of that manure sites define some of the gradients in our area. So the manure sites tended to have higher soil test phosphorus. We had higher runoff from the soil, from the manured sites, higher organic matter, and much higher water extractable phosphorus. And even our microbial data showed it was higher in our manured sites. We also saw a lot of correlation among the different parameters. What I'm showing here are the various soil parameters on the left, everything from our chemical parameters, a lot of carbon, nitrogen parameters, phosphorus parameters, and then the biological parameters in the middle, and some of our physical parameters on the left side here, and or on the bottom, excuse me. And you can see that there's a lot of correlation amongst the carbon factors, POX, soil organic carbon and so on, as well as some of the other nutrients. And with the microbial biomass was highly related to soil carbons and total nitrogen. Clearly, the manure factor was a big piece. So with sites with manure tended to have a higher content of all of those nutrient-derived parameters. So that's kind of the snapshot of the soil data. The water data I show here, this is USGS data, again, for the different sites in Indiana, Michigan, Ohio, New York, and Wisconsin. And one of the things you see is that we had higher volumes of runoff at the Wisconsin sites, typically relative to the other sites. If we look at, they tend to also have the higher concentrations of suspended sediments, phosphorus, and nitrogen. And again, we're only focused on surface water in this particular analysis. And then if we look on the far right, these are our yields in kilograms per hectare. And again, the Wisconsin sites that are in dairy, corn silage, and tend to have the high nutrient enrichment tend to have the highest losses. They also tend to be a little bit more clayey and have a little bit more slope as well. So our challenge then was linking that soil health data from infield to this edge of field water quality. And the approach we took, in addition to doing some just univariate sort of looking at relationships, is we tried to collapse a lot of our data down using a principal components analysis. We used 24 soil variables and then use those in a general linear model analysis. And the ones that were chosen, the PC1 was fertility based, and it had most of this, it was related to higher carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, microbial biomass, and also soil, subsoil compaction. And then PC2 was related to the physical parameters and so forth. In the GLM analysis, then we only chose the top two predictive variables. So the 4 PCs were used, as well as 5 site variables: tile, size, area, slope, manure, and tillage. And the net effect was that the concentrations of all of our response variables were related to PC1, was selected again, this enrichment of carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, and microbial activity. And suspended sediment concentration also included tillage, which again made sense. We didn't find a lot of good models for ortho-P or total P yield, but we did see strong univariate relationships with water extractable phosphorus, as well as some of the other constituents. So it's consistent with what Will's data is showing. So here I'm showing water extractable phosphorus versus total phosphorus on the right, and orthophosphorus losses in edge of field water quality, aggregated over 3 water years. So we see this strong relationship. So we did our work on working farms, which often the acute activities of those farms, whether it was management practices related to tillage, cover crop planting, manure application types, timing, location, has had an impact on the edge of field water quality and really bypassed the soil in many cases. Our soil health parameters were highly correlated and not that surprising. The manure factor was a significant piece to our study. And as I mentioned, also in some cases, acute losses. The sites that had the greatest export also had the highest nutrient levels in the soil, even though, and again, this is consistent with the Ohio work, that these sites had the most favorable soil organic matter and some of the most favorable microbial soil health indicators. So it's difficult to tease out the soil health signal on these sites, particularly because of these other factors where we're sort of bypassing the whole green box that I show here and directly impacting edge of field practices. And then, so I think, again, consistent with what Will had said, is that soil health practices versus soil health attributes, we need to keep that in mind, and that there's trade-offs. And I think one of the co-authors on Will's paper, Emily Duncan, in the paper they published in 2019, talks about this, speaks to this idea that there's, particularly with phosphorus, there's some significant trade-offs between soil health practices, soil health, and water quality losses. And I'll end there. Thank you.
All right, great. All right. Thank you, Kevin, and thank you, Will and Ron. Let's dive into a few of these questions here if we're able to. It looks like my first question is for Ron, but I would be curious to see Ron, Will, and Kevin, if you have thoughts as well. Marcel asked, Ron, you said it was difficult to sort out the specific impacts of specific practices on watershed water quality. What study would you like to do that would sort out these relationships? I think that's a critical question here as we see some of the nuances, in a perfect world, how would we measure this?
Yeah, it's a really difficult answer. The question's great, but the answer is two things. It's really difficult and it's really expensive. So you basically have to parse the systems up so that you can control the variables like you would do in a highly refined reductive experiment, right? So it's a difficult, because we end up with these lumped systems when we go to the field. We don't know a farmer. We've dealt with farmers who, and Kevin especially, has dealt with people who have changed things in the middle of the experiment. That's a very common problem we run into. We're sort of tracking on something, and all of a sudden somebody's decided they want to till, and they've been in no-till for 5 years, or 10 years, and the no-till was a key part of their no-till was a key part of our question set about how does that affect something, and all of a sudden they're changing it, and it's all messed up. So we would like to see. We would propose that we look at smaller pieces of different things over longer periods of time, but that's difficult to do because it's expensive, and nobody seems to want to support that kind of reductionist experiment where we look at the key parts of a process to define things. Cover crop, no-till, those kind of things are great. We typically see them combined. It's hard to sort out the actual implications of one over the other. We see a lot of nutrient management planning where we are, that we get those with no-till and cover crops most of the time. So we don't get that. That's why we ended up with the practice codes that we were using, because we tended to have these things lumped together. And that became sort of our units of science. With what we were dealing with out of the watershed became how we had to redefine our experiments around those practices that were going on. So I'm sure Will and Kevin have both experienced the same situation. So.
Yeah, Will or Kevin, any thoughts on that?
Well, I was just to say, one of the approaches that we've talked about in our team is similar to what I think Will's team is proposing, or they started with this idea. Can we start to look at sites that we know have this high soil health function potentially, and maybe it's a combination of practices, and sort of document that side by side. But the time factor is significant here, right? To get to that fully functioning multiple ecosystem services status of the soil, particularly ones that have been intensively industrially farmed for 100 years.
Yeah, I think that's why we're pretty excited about this new project that I showed at the end of my talk. Again, we just have that first year of data, but it was pretty encouraging. I think from my reading of the literature, some of the best results we've seen up to this point of, sort of a soil health system having positive effects on water quality. So hopefully we can get some more of those, identify those practitioners that have those long-term systems, and maybe target some effort towards trying to quantify what they're able to achieve.
And I would really emphasize what Will just said about, and Kevin also, about time, right? So you can put cover crops in, but you're not going to see the same kind of system today you'll see in 8 years. So if you continue your cover crop practices, right? So there's this time component, which is sort of a very awkward thing for us, because we don't necessarily have the capacity sometimes to go that far with these studies. So these long-term studies are really important. That's why we tend to spend a lot of time looking at what's going on in the watershed and finding people who have been in practices for a long time and trying to convince them to come into the study. So we know their history. So we sort of switch out sometimes things we don't want to switch out, but we want to get certain things that have been in place a long time, because we know those practices can have really significant impacts. So.
Yeah, that's a great point. So I'm going to skip down here to a question for Will. because I think it gets at that last study or case study that you were showing. Scott's curious about non-tiled cropland. Is ARS collecting infiltration rates with other soil health characteristics? It appears the more infiltration rates can increase with significant soil health improvement, reducing runoff and thus reducing the DRP.
Yeah, so we generally in Ohio we focus on northwest portion of the state, which is heavily tile drained, just because of the soil types up there, and because we have tile drainage and surface runoff, we can look at a little bit the partitioning of water through those different pathways. We tried to do that in the article analysis, and didn't find any really strong connections between the soil parameters we measured and how much runoff versus tile drainage was happening. But in that sort of case study where we have the long-term soil health management, 30 years, we did see that there was less runoff and also less tile drainage. So to me, that means that there's probably more storage in the soil. So I think that's sort of the ideal situation where you want water to stay in the system and not be leaving either through runoff or tile drainage, especially not runoff from a water quality standpoint.
Yeah, absolutely. I think Laura's question here kind of gets at what you're saying and a little bit of some of the main findings here that I could be wrong. Laura knows, I understand that nutrient levels appear to be higher in soils that are healthier, but that water runoff is less. Overall, is the total nutrient loading reduced as a result of decreased flow from the healthy soils? And again, that's probably only for the case study, or, it's in that particular finding, right?
Yeah, that's right. And I think that also sort of highlights my point that it's not necessarily the soil parameters themselves that are driving a lot of this. I do think it is the presence of a cover crop, actually being on that field, sort of irregardless of if that field has really good soil health or just mediocre soil health. I think having that cover crop is going to have a bigger impact. That's just based on what we've seen in Ohio up to this point. So take it with a grain of salt, but that's kind of where we're at right now.
Okay, great question for Kevin from Tony. Please explain a little bit, and I saw maybe you had answered a question from Andrew about this. Please explain a little bit more about manured fields in Wisconsin. You had said they had higher soil health attributes. What were the STP levels? And even some of the best soil health will not mitigate elevated STP, tillage, and continued manure applications. Looks like Andrew was also asking a little bit about manure as that key factor, and was it on corn silage fields, applied versus injected, and winter on frozen ground, right? All those different factors that lead to runoff with manure application.
Yeah, so I think their observations are right in that, the Wisconsin sites had elevated soil test phosphorus above agronomic crop needs, typically. Again, this was in corn silage and sort of continuous corn silage, partly as a baseline conditions for moving towards more soil health practices. But as some of the farmers have moved towards the soil health practices, particularly with manure, the challenge of how that manure goes on, and there tends to be a bit more manure going closer to the surface than being incorporated, and sort of those are some of the trade-offs. And again, that paper about that I had in my slide there, I think it's with Duncan et al. They specifically, that article I think does a great job of talking about these trade-offs, and clearly we need to have nutrient management, particularly if the soils are enriched with phosphorus, has to be a critical piece to the puzzle, because these other soil health benefits, even if we could even store more water and infiltrate more and have the best nutrient cycling going on, that excess nutrients is highly vulnerable to loss, and we're seeing it leave the fields.
Yeah, absolutely. Next question is from from Paul for Ron, but I would guess all of you probably have thoughts on this. It's really about the social science and the human dimensions of it. Paul asked, do you see any correlation between those who were not interested in more conservation BMPs for soil health and age, or the number of years of farming, or any other reason that farming weren't interested? I'm sure all of y'all have thoughts on that social aspect, but certainly the project with St. Mary's, you did a lot of outreach. So, working with the community members.
We did a ton of outreach. We did a kind of a whole educational program that was a separate part of the project. And we did this whole human dimensions survey aspect of the project that was headed up by Linda Propicki, who sort of known for that work. The biggest component of that was actually who runs the farm, tenants versus landowner location. So we have a lot of farm ground in that part, as well as the rest of the world in the United States, who the farm owner is not on the property. They're somewhere else, typically some retired, or they're just having the property managed by someone. Those people, those systems tended to be less inclined to use conservation practices, we found. With that, we were having a hard time reaching the tenant farm type people or the management people, as opposed to people who were actually living on the farm and who had specific direct interest in the long-term value of the property. So that was a jump we had to figure out. We're still working on trying to figure out how to get around that, where we would bring those people into more discussions. But there's also, I think, the average age of our audience that took our survey, I believe, if I remember the data correctly, it was something in the 60s range. So both participating individuals and non-participating were basically in the same age range. So there was not a really clear definition around age at all. So, but it was more on who was the actual owner of the land versus who was actually running the property. That was a big split point.
Yeah, absolutely. I know in Linda's work and other social stuff, NOLA's, the notion of a non-operating landowner certainly being key to practice implementation for key people. Kevin or Will, did you have any thoughts about that from your studies? I'm sure, working in this for a long time, you've definitely seen other characteristics. And yes, there are people who are dedicating all of their research to these aspects. No comment. Leave the social science to the social scientists. Fair enough. Will, I think this question is for you, and I think it's important to address because I don't think it's what you're saying, but you can correct me if I'm wrong. This question is from Tony. He's saying, Will, based on your conclusions, it appears you would advocate that we could till our way to better water quality. Is that true? I don't see that as really what you're saying, though. You are saying it's a nuanced picture. I'll defer to you on that one.
Yeah, I'm sorry that's the message Tony got, but that's not what I was trying to convey. I do think the management practices are super important for water quality. Tillage itself, I think it is a sort of a nuanced picture. It's sort of site specific, I would argue. If you have a highly erodible situation, of course, tillage is always going to be a bad idea. If you're really worried about phosphorus and you need to apply manure, then maybe tillage would be a good practice to help incorporate that manure. So I think there are situations that tillage can be helpful from a water quality standpoint, but I wouldn't go so far as to just a blanket statement of saying we should till and that'll help us with water quality. I think it's a lot more nuanced than that.
Yeah, absolutely. Not a linear relationship by any means. So I think this question might be for you, Kevin, but I definitely see it for all three of you when it comes to the timelines of tile drainage. So Bob is curious, what is the relationship between nutrient loads in the tile drainage and spring soil frost outdates? Also, what is the relationship between nutrient loads at edge of field surface runoff and spring soil frost outdates in manured fields? So I certainly see that in the upper parts of the north central region here with this spring frost, spring melt seasons.
Y'all have to defer the tile question to Will since their data has more information that I know about in the tile data. We actually don't have as much tile data in Wisconsin overall on edge of field water quality. But clearly the wintertime applications of manure and or the timing of application of manure relative to major spring runoff is a key driver to annual loads at the edge of field, particularly in our partially frozen time of the year landscape that we live in. And I think there's been a number of nice summaries on that over the last few years about the impacts of the of losses during frozen times and during that thaw period. I think there's some evidence coming out of Canada that's shifting as well, that the time period of that thaw and those flush, the time period of runoff is shifting. And that is some concern, I think, as well.
Thanks for that. Will, any comment on the tile drainage?
In Ohio, we don't typically see total freeze up. Our tiles tend to run through the winter. It's probably the same for Ron there in Indiana. I will say that we do see the largest discharge and nutrient loads during late winter into the spring. So that is clearly the key season. That's also the season that if we're thinking about Lake Erie, the nutrients coming out during that time of year tend to drive the algal blooms. So that's really should be the focus for nutrient loss mitigation efforts. Should really key in on that late winter, early spring time period.
Our work, not from this project, other projects we have on tile drainage, would concur completely with what Will just said in terms of late winter, spring, a few warm days, a little bit of microbial activity, a little bit of oxygen, a little bit of rainfall, boom, your tile lines will be running with nitrate pretty quick. So, and it moves out. So it has a lot to do with, if you think about it, how you applied nitrogen in the fall. If you did apply a fall nitrogen application, then you're going to have some issues. You could have issues in the tile water related to that because you don't have an active crop to take that nitrogen up. So there's a lot of these nuances, like Will and Kevin have mentioned, nuancy things around management, and that's a big piece of this. Why are you doing things the way you're doing them? And they were never. A lot of those management practices were not designed with a water quality or a soil health thing in component in that description of how they put that together. They were mostly looking at yield issues, which is fine. That's what they were there for. But there's some side issues that have come to light of late. So,
yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, I think we maybe have time for one more quick question. Brenda has a question. I think, Kevin, this was for you, which was curious what type of NRCS funding was used in the study besides 319 funded one. But I don't know if that is pertinent to Ron as well.
We were the only one, I think, of this group who used 319 money. Kevin's is a whole different kind of money.
Yeah, ours is NRCS through some of the funding through the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative practices, and again, or not practices, but studies and implementation of soil health practices across the Great Lakes, and then USGS's funding that they have to help evaluate that, and then our piece was added to that overall study. Just again, to build this link and find out, I think we're raising more questions, we're maybe identifying more questions than we are answers, but that's typical of the, I guess, the learning circle of soil health and research and water quality. So. Yeah,
absolutely. Well, I think that's a great way to end it today. Thank you guys so much for your time here and your expertise. Yeah. I am going to put up real quick the link to each of our presenters' emails. If you had a burning question today that I was not able to address in the Q&A, feel free to reach out to them directly. And I also want to, just as a reminder, that this webinar was recorded. We will post it on our website at northcentralwater.org. We will also post the webinar slides here too, because I know we got several requests for those on our website at northcentralwater.org. And I encourage you to join us next month for the current webinar series. And also join us this next month in Duluth in July. We're hosting a Climate Intersections Conference focusing on climate and equity and how we as climate, natural resources, and agricultural professionals can help our communities be more resilient in the face of a changing climate. So I hope you'll join us for that conversation. Information on that conference, as well as the webinar recording, can all be found on our website at northcentralwater.org. So thank you so much, Ron, Will, and Kevin. I really appreciate your time today. And thanks so much, everyone here, for joining us. Have a great rest of your afternoon.
Thanks, everyone.